This is Marc Mullinax, and you're listening to Power for the Peaceful, a podcast and class on Taoism. The basic tenet of Taoist thought is that the operation of the human world should be ideally continuous with that of the natural order, and that one should restore the continuity by freeing the self from the restrictive influence of social norms, moral precepts, and worldly goals. Oxford Companion to Philosophy, 2nd edition. Welcome to this introductory podcast, a course designed to teach the basics of Taoism, what Tao means, what it means for us as individuals, and most of all, what Tao means for our collective existence. Today, I offer several hundred potential listeners, like you, a trial podcast and ask you to write back to me with your comments, suggestions, critiques, thoughts, and questions regarding the production and content values of this episode. Just respond via the medium by which you found this trial podcast, and I'll get it. Also, feel free to forward the links to your friends or others who might appreciate studying Taoism. Tell them I expect to begin the official podcast with weekly episodes in January of 2023. So who am I and what business do I have making this podcast? I am the author-translator of Tao Te Ching, Power for the Peaceful, copyright 2021 by Fortress Press and 1517 Media. This podcast will contain and expand on many elements of that book, and I encourage you to find mine or another translation of Tao Te Ching as you go through this course. As of this broadcast date, there are 41 reviews for my translation on Amazon, and each is a 5-star review. I am an emeritus professor of religious studies at Mars Hill University in Western North Carolina. I treat this course like I do my own university courses, as the most important and fun thing I get to do. However, you decide what you do with this information I'll provide. I give no test, but it seems that life is always giving us tests, doesn't it? Tests of choice, tests of patience, tests of endurance, of justice. This course will help with all these tests, I promise. And at the end of each episode, listen out for homework, things you can actually do to put what you learn into practice. Today, an introduction to Taoism, Tao Te Ching, and the worldviews that produce them. Taoism is an ancient Chinese spirituality and worldview. Now, if you're new to Taoism, welcome aboard. You're listening to the very first episode of a podcast focused on how we may learn from, in our troubled time, an ancient but still practiced Chinese spirituality called Taoism, a spirituality based upon Taoism's main scripture called Tao Te Ching, or in English translation, the classic text concerning the way of virtue. Now, Tao has many meanings, but many of which you've already know. The Do in Judo and Taekwondo and Aikido, Bushido, Hapkido is the same character as Tao. And that literally means way, but can also be interpreted as road and flow or path or even doctrine. Tao Te Ching is the most translated spiritual text in the world, except for the New Testament. So I think, after 2,500 years, Tao still speaks. Back in the day, however, Tao Te Ching was the earliest human metaphysical attempt to speak about the theory of everything, how things began, how things were, are, and shall ever be, both one and interconnected. It's when we lose sight of this unitive understanding of Tao and the origins of all creation that we get into trouble. But then we begin to separate what is meant to be one and undivided. The separated self is the basis of every sin. We are already one. We just think of ourselves as separated. Thomas Merton. Tao Te Ching was first written in a time like ours, when old structures and underpinning society decayed and declined. New technologies made their appearances. Untested leaders flaunted their ego-assisted authority, and not much else. False teachings and conspiracy theories proliferated, and restless people sought recompense for centuries-old alleged harms. Life seemed busy and unhappy, also violent. It was the era of Chinese history called the Warring States period. When we think of what China is today, think of it as divided into 7 competing nations back then. I'll let you draw any comparisons for your own with modern life. The ascending philosophy of the day was Confucianism, This was a moral philosophy on its good days, and it organized chaotic Chinese society with rules of appropriate behavior according to one's station in life. On his not-so-good days, Confucianism prioritized human conformity with the strongly hierarchical social norms of the ruling classes. Life for those under Confucianism, especially women, the poor, and the underclasses, was very hard, very structured, and made human beings on every strata slaves to forces and energies alien to natural human nature. This is because Confucianism is itself based upon a peculiar view of human nature, one which blesses human concocted hierarchies, but does not understand nature or the natural world itself. Into this hierarchically complex and volatile cauldron, Lao Tzu introduced the revolutionary ideas of non-doing, emptiness, darkness, and silence as practices for wisdom. Here's a brief intro to each. Non-doing throws a revolutionary light on what and how to do. We'll speak much more about the power of revolutionary non-doing, also called Wu Wei, which is one of Taoism's premier teachings. For in non-doing, one is also non-violent. That is, one intentionally does nothing to bring about real change, because doing nothing exposes the utter bankruptcy of ego or state-assisted aggressions. As for emptiness, how many of us get so full of ourselves that we grind to a halt from the burdens of stress, ownership, and managing all that stuff of life we somehow came to feel is important? As for darkness, think about the darkness of a creative womb, and how in darkness is the only place where we can see the light of candles or get reoriented to our pole stars. Darkness has its primeval place, and it's way too bad that many Western worldviews equate darkness with evil. Silence is very hard for us, but silence is the absolute resistance to the seemingly ubiquitous habits of commotion and noise that we have been so carefully taught. Through advertising, socialization, and education, so carefully taught is necessary. Dings, chimes, chirps, radio, TV seem to be never quietened companions. Before there were words, there was another, and yet so different language. A language with vocabulary, but in a syntax of silence, and so countercultural to our cultures of noise. Quiet is quieting. When we cultivate silence, we begin to hear things that have always been there, but have been covered up by the 10,000 noises. What remains after silencing these 10,000 disturbances? What remains is original peace, discoverable after emptying out all that unnecessary noise. Silence is the Taoist practice, and because it is so countercultural and yet so natural, maintaining one's silence in a culture of noise is a revolutionary act. Pascal said that our problem is distraction, and the solution is not more distraction, but quietened attention. Such attention is the soul's vocation. The skill response is not more noise, but more silence. We're taught how to talk, but not how much to listen. To push the ego-assisted self forward in the world, but not to erase the self. The illusion of being a self, or in control, on top of things, does not last long when you're at decibel level 0. Just picture agitated, muddy water going calm just by being silent and still. In my kitchen, there's this quiet refrigerator, and it kicks on every once in a while, and the noise it makes quickly becomes background noise. And it becomes normal. But when it kicks off, I can hear anew all those sounds that have always been there, but which have been masked, such as the stream out back, birds in the nearby tree, the purring of the cat in my lap. As I will say often in future pods, Tao is always there, for it is the blueprint of all creation in the universe. But we may have forgotten it, like I forget my refrigerator. When life is heavy and hard to take, go off by yourself and enter the silence. Lamentations 3:28. Now more than ever, now in this time and in our culture, one could not ask, I think, for a better wisdom source for living wisely in these days of climate change, or what to do in conflict situations, or even how to, I think, work for a fair, non-racist, and more egalitarian culture. Taoism teaches these things. It teaches how everything is originally equitable and connected across time, across species, across space. And therefore, justice and peace are not just our primordial states, but are actually baked into the original blueprints of the universe. Just take a moment with that thought. Most Western interpreters of Tao leave out this crucial idea of justice and Tao. So the title of the podcast is an intentional one, Power for the Peaceful. Simply put, the inequities and injustices you recognize in our world are not baked in, not original, but rather consequences of our unmanaged desires to promote egos, to exploit, to compete, to become number one and remain great, and most sadly, to think of ourselves as unconnected with others and with this universe that evolved us. Tao is a corrective. Our primordial connection with the makeup of the universe is the power for peace that makes this Taoist text as relevant as this morning's New York Times. My elementary thesis is this: our original nature, our natural origin, is Tao. When we forget or lay aside this number one teaching, we change into someone or something else: forgetful, artificial, destructive, running on ego, someone desiring the wrong things for the wrong reasons, or individuals who think they are standalones, forgetting that they and Tao are the same stuff and the same energy. In Taoism, we're all here with innate belonging. But if we ignore this, we tend to cast these rocks of destruction into situations that ripple out into the cosmos for years. Think karma. But the reverse is also true. One can wisely place stones to build connections, bridges, beauty. And these too ripple out for years. Good karma. And that's the strategic difference between living a life forgetful of Tao and a life within Tao. Learning about Tao is to learn how to turn rocks of violence into stepping stones of community. So, what is Tao? Is it like God? No, but when Western Christians translated the New Testament book of John into Chinese, they used, and still use today, Tao for John's first verse, which reads like this. In the beginning was the Word. They use Tao. In the beginning was the word Tao, because Tao is a Chinese term for word. And the Word or Tao was with God, and the Word or Tao was God. For John 14:6 later on, the interpreters use Tao yet again to translate Jesus' words there. I am the Tao. English Bibles use way. I am the Tao, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God except through me. So Tao and Tao Te Ching is something else. It's not personal. It's not God. It's not invested in outcomes. For Tao is the way, the path, the flow, the process by which the universe actually operates. The operating system. Tao is the energy of, the blueprints underlying, the inherent peace of, and the spontaneously natural balance within all creation. Tao is nature. Before we even had a concept of nature, before there was a human knowledge system telling us about our human nature, before there was spoken human language, Tao is already forming and informing our true nature by different fluencies. Learning about Tao is to become more fluent about the nature of the universe and its often mysterious processes. This is not an otherworldly spirituality in which one's true home is in an afterlife or in a heaven, but it's a creation-based spirituality, teaching us how to live in this time, this place, in the now, the here, and the this. Hashtag now hear this. So again, Tao is the first attempt by human beings to posit a theory of everything and how this everything is radically, as in rooted in connection. And that's coming up next. I speak now about an idea you've heard, and of which I am convinced. We live in a web of interlocking energies with ancient origins, and we are here to share, participate, but not own or manipulate them. There's a flow to everything, and since we come from this flow, it is in our original nature to stay with this flow. Since we are part of creation, Tao shows us how everything that has ever been and began, and how all things were, are, and shall be both ever one and interconnected. Hashtag interlocked. Our breath is the same breath in plants. Our energy is the same energy that forms rocks. The 60% water within us comprises the same ancient molecules in monsoons, that baptizes kids, that flows over your favorite waterfall, that created the Grand Canyon, or that you drank earlier today. Because of our ancient connections with the energies of the universe, we do well to remember how we are not ourselves until we realize how connected and interlocked we are with the rest of creation. So this course in Tao seeks to show these intermingling connections at our most basic levels and our most exalted levels. If the universe is connected naturally, then it seems our constant efforts to make any other identity for us will be magnificently failed efforts. We just don't appear on this planet willy-nilly. We are not aliens, but we emerge uniquely from evolutionary processes billions of years old, kind of like apples can only emerge from an apple tree. Ecology, wrote E.F. Schumacher in his small as beautiful book. Ecology holds that an environmental setting developed over millions of years must be considered to have some merit. Anything so complicated as a planet, inhabited by over 1.5 million species of plants and animals, all of them living together in a more or less balanced equilibrium in which they continuously use and reuse the same molecules of air and soil, cannot be improved by aimless and uninformed tinkering. Tao is the very energy of creation itself. The same patterns and principles that characterize and govern all the Amazon forest governs humans too. The blueprint for all creation has but one source, Tao. There is not a blueprint for oceans, and another one for land animals, and then another one for human beings. The energy of a plant is fundamentally no different from that of a human being. All existence is shared. There are no singles, no isolation. It's a we, not a me. Us, not I. But in our hubris, have we forged a synthetic, artificial, human-centered bias? Maybe we have no idea, none, what blueprints we violate in our aspirations to control and own and manage. However, harmony is our origin and our destiny. Why not practice it now? To follow Tao means awareness and the practices of mutuality and cooperation with nature or creation. Verse 29 in Tao Te Ching reads like this. Rhythm. Because Tao shapes nature, all things under heaven run by sublime spiritual rhythm. Can you improve it? It's doubtful. Meddling only blocks Tao's flow. Control is another name for lose. Folks, there is great revolutionary energy in this. Tao is both greater and other than its parts. I think after 2,500 years, Tao still speaks. May we still listen? Why should we? Let me try to say this yet one more way. Those who live into this text, and other Taoist texts, I think, grasp and perhaps live into the utter limits of human achievement. That is, when connected to Tao, we're most human, which is what we're meant to be. Living with and teaching this text for 4 decades, I have found Tao ever my touchstone and spiritual magnetic north. Tao has been my return to clarity in frenetic or uncertain times. Tao is my reminder to be patient, not competitive, and to let go and not work my ego, Tetris-like, into every endeavor. Tao Te Ching speaks in any setting, from the boardroom to the caucus hall, from the classroom to the streets. It's not just found in, quote, nature, unquote. It's also discovered in a prison cell. So this podcast comes to you from one convinced of Tao's utter reality and claims. As traditional religions' influences decline due to their civil wars within and uncivil wars without, can we yet hear a 2,500-year-old voice of bold wisdom that's both timely and timeless? A wisdom unique in its teaching and resonant with world's wisdom's traditions? Let's be plain. The reputation of Tao Te Ching is sometimes that it is a nearly indecipherable text for mystics to read and consider within the privacy of their home. The Tao is not the best guides of life for public affairs or cultural critiques, business ventures, or even scientific endeavors. And I feel this artificial split too. But in this podcast, I shall bridge these gaps. This scripture's real value comes when we perceive Tao still at work in and influencing and having a wise word for the everyday and the everything, no matter the context. That's my task and my test for this podcast. The Tao Te Ching contains living teachings, discussions to be had, not just ancient riddles preserved in a jar. Seamus Robertson. I hope to demonstrate Seamus's quote many times in the more than 100 weekly episodes I am planning for you. Because Tao's power for the peaceful is built into creation. It is not just ours, but the very birthright of all things, from the bird at your bird feeder to the endangered species or endangered people and anything or anyone else you may imagine. Many Aboriginal cultures have understood and understand nature as sacred, a wild, huge, untamed, interlocking handshake of energies, powers, and life in which a moral spirit inhabits all. To be most human is simple. Live in these energies. Do not exploit them for personal gain. For many millennia, and still in places around the world, people believe they live in a sacred place, a spirit-filled time, a place where rocks speak, mountains hear, trees bear witness, and water connects all. Nature is alive, and it speaks still for those who listen. So your homework. Go out into what you consider nature. Doesn't matter if it's for an hour or for a day, and leave behind things that chirp, ring, or have screens. Go with an attitude of openness, of listening, of quieting your inner voices of criticism, desire, or impatience. And if you're quiet, you'll hear many voices, from the sounds of birds or animals to wind whispering in the trees, the sign language of clouds, or the mountain ranges in the distance. What is nature saying? Begin to become fluent in these sights and sounds. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time given us, said Gandalf, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, Chapter 2, by J.R.R. Tolkien. This podcast is an original work, designed, written, and produced by me, Marc Mullinax. Artwork by Audrey Davis. Music is licensed by Cyber Director. The copyright for quotations from Tao Te Ching is held by Fortress Press. When this becomes a real podcast, my experimental listeners, I'll ask you to support it by sharing it, by subscribing to its feed, by posting reviews on your podcast site so others may find it, and maybe through Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, let me know if you might find Patreon a helpful way to support this podcast. But most of all, I hope together we can approach life more realistically and with fullness, joy, and freedom. May your days begin in peace and become laboratories for radical hope. This is Marc Mullinax, and you're listening to Power for the Peaceful, a podcast and class on Taoism. The Tao Te Ching is one long poem written in praise of something we cannot name, much less imagine. Red Pine. Welcome to my course, designed to teach the basics of Taoism, what Tao means, what it means for us as individuals, and most of all, what Tao means for our collective existences. Today, I offer several hundred potential listeners like you the second of 2 trial podcasts and ask you to write back to me with your comments and suggestions, your critiques or thoughts, and questions regarding the production and content values of this episode. Just respond via the medium by which you found this trial podcast, and I'll get it. Also, feel free to forward the links to your friends or others who would appreciate studying Taoism. tell them I expect to begin the official podcast with weekly episodes sometime this month. I am excited. So who am I, and what business have I making this podcast? I'm the author-translator of Tao Te Ching, Power for the Peaceful, copyright 2021 by Fortress Press and 1517 Media. This podcast will contain and expand on many elements of that book, and I encourage you to find mine or another translation of Tao Te Ching as you go through this course. And kind of humbly speaking, as of this broadcast date, there are 41 reviews on my translation on Amazon, and each is a 5-star review. I am also Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Mars Hill University in Western North Carolina. I will treat this course like I do my own university courses as the most important and most fun thing I get to do. However, you decide what to do with this information. I give no test, but it seems that life is always going to give us tests of choice, patience, tests of endurance, or justice. This course will help with those tests, I promise. And at the end of each episode, listen out for homework, things you can actually do to put what you learn into practice. Today, verse 1, Tao's Way. Our long march through Tao Te Ching begins. I anticipate one verse per week, except when we take breaks in their sequence by introducing or reinforcing themes that emerge, such as wu wei or non-doing, being just, slowing down, yin and yang, and maybe even having some guests to talk with. I also would love to hear your questions, and we could have those, perhaps one question per episode, or maybe an occasional entire episode devoted just to questions. For today, however, we start our course by emphasizing how Tao bears witness only through mystery, silence, and non-desiring. So it is important to get a few things clear from the very beginning. And, as inside information, there's a lot of pressure among translators to do an unforgettable translation job on this first verse, for it sets a tone on how one might translate the other 80 verses. And this tidbit. In these podcasts, I will have lots of quotes, which will be introduced by Temple Bell. In today's episode, there will be many references to Hebrew Bible passages and personalities. This will not be the usual case, but the Hebrew witnesses today seem to bunch up in this podcast because of the ways they bear witness to silence. Also, there may be a temptation among us to correlate Tao with God. I hope we can resist that temptation. Enough introduction. Let's get on to it. Our Tao Te Ching author, traditionally thought of as scholar Lao Tzu, begins with a warning that one cannot consider or speak directly about Tao. In other words, no words, just suggestions, hints, and bearing silent witness, and indirect advice. This verse reminds me so much in its intent of the second of the 10 commandments found in Exodus, chapter 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. For the Hebrew audience, nothing, not even human language, can represent the divine, so be careful lest you associate something created for an uncreated thing. The same idea is the very beginning of Tao Te Ching. Let's present verse 1 in its entirety. I'm going to be using my own translation for these podcasts. And there's perhaps a new word in this verse for some listeners, logorrhea, which is, in short, excessive wordiness. So here it goes. Verse 1, Tao's Way. Any track one can walk is no path for the eternal way. Any name one might borrow for Tao cannot summon it. For names are just sounds for ordinary things. Before paths or words, Tao began all there is, but to start the naming, trying to tame it, begins a never-ending logorrhea, powered by ego and desire, and leading one astray. Not desiring is the only way to glimpse this mystery. Desiring, all one sees are husks and appearances. But both desiring and non-desiring are twins, birthed in the same darkened mystery. Through this dark lies the path to all wisdom. This is Tao's style. I think the explicit reason why we're not given a clear roadmap or description of Tao from these very first lines is that Lao Tzu distrusted mediated experiences. Words and language, desire or roadmaps These are not reliable guides. The roadmap is not the territory of Tao. Desire shows only mirages. Language can be tailored and shaped in order to mislead. So Tao has nothing that can represent it. Only not desiring is helpful, which for most of us is a mystery also. I mean, how can one get close to something or someone without desire? What does it mean even to be non-desirous? So at Tao Te Ching's beginning, there's this warning sign, a fence, a barrier to the usual methods of spiritual inquiry. Why is this? The text we know as Tao Te Ching has this story as its beginning. The purported author is Lao Tzu, who probably thrived in China in the 6th century BCE, but even this is contested among scholars. Lao Tzu means old master. He served in the imperial archives of China, so the story goes like this. One day, he grew tired of his life in China and sought to live abroad. At the Hankou Pass, the border guard had recognized this wise person and that Lao Tzu was fixing to leave with all his wisdom in his head or heart. What a loss that would be. So the guard implored Lao Tzu before he immigrated to write down his wisdom. And in manuscript, Lao Tzu wrote a poem of 5,000 words, has come down to be what we understand as Taoism's primary text. I imagine Lao Tzu cringed at being asked to put his thoughts into words. His teachings were all about the untapped or forgotten powers of silence, of non-doing, and the wordlessness of Tao, of darkness, no action, and just bearing silent witness in such matters. For him to write about such topics would send the wrong message, that one could actually talk about such mysteries. He thought, you can't talk about Tao. You can only point, be indirect, and not discuss. And this needs to be seen as the background essence of our verse number 1 today. So in this episode about verse 1, let us today begin with a bit of humility about our ability to name and understand Tao in the first place. Indirect ways, not using words, not desiring, and not doing are the ways to Tao, which can be translated as the way. Better silence than sound and fury, signifying nothing. But this puts us today in a quandary. I'm talking words, and you're listening to words about something unwordable, speaking about the unspeakable. So here's my folly. I'm about to use words to talk about the wordless. Please forgive me, everyone. What is Tao? I cannot say. No human language is capable of saying what it is. Tao has no proprietary language, not even Chinese. When we attempt to conjure Tao in human language, we can only hope for the translation to be what the poet John Charty called the best possible failure. You might as well attempt to define what a dream is. We all know what a dream is, but to define it, that's tricky. The language of God is silence. All else is poor translation. Rumi. Tao was there, silently bearing witness before language organized human life together. Tao is already old before the first chirps, squawks, roars, or human words. We could use the Hebrew prophet Isaiah's thought to demonstrate the difference and the distance between Tao's realm and the human realm of speech. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. I believe Lao Tzu would say that thinking, or using words, destroys the immediacy of life. What is the immediacy of life? It means having no filters between you and your experience. Musicians and athletes, you get this. Just imagine, musicians and athletes, if you started to think. Thinking or voicing actual words, what you're supposed to be doing with your body in your performance. That is, you talk about which fingers or body parts are to move and how fast and how loudly and so on. Music and athletics are pre-verbal body processes accomplished without words. Words and thinking only slow down and interrupt. If words destroy the immediacy of life, is it possible to restore this immediacy? Yes. Stop using words. Be like an athlete or musician and flow. Stop rehearsing and just be. States of being cannot be worded out and explained rationally because life's most powerful and necessary experiences come wordless. Hashtag love. Hashtag ecstasy. Hashtag connection. So, if we cannot speak Tao's name, might we be able to hear or sense it? What might Tao sound like if we cannot in-word it? As John O'Donohue phrases it, the passion of the wind, the fluency of water, the warmth of fire, the quiver touch of the sun, and shadowed sureness of the moon. Here's some more. Bees working in the garden is what Tao sounds like. Spring's brilliant colors and hues, found especially in flowers, are what Tao can look like. A forest's soundscape and its smells, including those of decay. The quirky but purposeful squirrel, flight patterns of butterflies, the winking of fireflies, serpentine twist of a stream, the twist of a serpent, the way that wind bends branches and makes micro-tornadoes of leaves, the eons-long process of water carving stones, the fleeting light shows of rainbows, the below-ground heartbeat of interconnected trees, the unfailing autonomic systems in us each that breathe, secrete the right hormones at the right time, that make us blink without thinking 15,000 or so times a day, one's gut microbiome that keeps one healthy, even sane, the quieting of a snowfall, the intricate ecosystem of a field, colors of autumn, water speaking its fluent sounds to all who take the time to listen, cries of pain, surprise, and anguish, the groans of a birthing mother and her baby's first mule, even cries of lament or feet marching for justice or Tao sound. And don't forget your voice, your natural fluency to join this massive choir across the ages. Just won't be the same without your voice, as young or shaky as it may be, for you are part of Tao's reach. Whatever sounds or languages arise from the earth, and however accented they are, these are Tao's sounds, its creeds, its confessions, and we may learn their fluencies. With no language, sound, or visible path, Tao is discovered in silence, just by walking along the way itself. Various sounds, many accents, each fluid and fluent sounds of Tao at play. They speak. Do we listen? Here's a short song snippet from the public domain song Put Your Roots Down, as led by Nehemiah Luckett.
Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear the earth sing if you listen.
Put your roots down, put your feet on the ground. You can hear the earth sing if you listen.
'Cause the sound of the river as it moves across the stones. 'Cause the
sound of the river as it moves across the stones
is the same sound as the blood in your body as it moves across your bones.
Is the same sound as the blood in your body as it moves across your bones.
Thomas Merton, in his translation of the Chuang Tzu, writes, "Where is Tao? Nowhere is it not to be found. It is in the ant. It is in the weeds. It is in this turd. Tao is great in all things, complete in all, universal in all, whole in all." So we ask, why wordless? Words are socially acceptable and reductive explanations for processes we don't always understand. Think of words as only handles or codes or even spells. For example, does the word God produce any understanding or conjure God's presence? Does saying the word fire summon fire or warm your hands? Does the shorthand word computer describe how it works? Does your name fully explain who you are? We human beings can only have human experiences. We cannot have other species experiences, so our words are just and only for our very thin slice of human affairs within this vast universe. That's the sense of this verse. Words are for human beings and our ordinary things. Tao is about everything. That's a whole different language, but it cannot be spoken. Rather, Tao is silent witness to and with everything, in every single thing. Unchecked, human language operates like a virus. It infects, multiplies, and even sickens. Words are contagious and proliferate, leading to more words, which morph into dogma, rules, shoulds, and must nots. Is this any way to live? Well, it is how we live. And Lao Tzu felt that the power for peace lay in reducing our reliance upon words and definitions. This first verse begins with a mystery. In the beginning is silence, not the word. Tao needs no concept, no principle or language to do its work. Its syntax is silence. So about that which we cannot know, instead of conjecturing, what if we were to practice silence and not speculation? For here's truth. When speaking, one can hear little. One mouth, two ears means perhaps we ought to listen twice as much as we speak. Here's the first line from verse 56 in Tao Te Ching. Those with answers do not know, and those who know do not answer. Seal the mouth. Mistrust the senses. So instead of defining and naming, maybe it's better to trust and to listen, not to control by naming. Control takes an entirely different energy than listening, and you know this. Just listening with someone as you talk with you, without interjecting your own thoughts, takes a whole different energy than racing ahead in your mind and preparing your own response. For in the end, human words are just watered-down ideas, reductive sounds for complex concepts. So to sound out Tao in words is to attempt to bring rational understanding, that is, control, to Tao. And our human habit is to give a name to our mysteries that have no intrinsic name, and then give only one name out of a multitude of names. And when that one name that we give becomes the name, the only name, a fundamentalism begins. Speaking as a former fundamentalism, I know that it is taking a single explanation of something mysterious, reducing it, and making that one idea the only idea. For people like to rally around one single idea and in its name declare that their enemies are not of that idea. So therefore words can lead to division when taken seriously. Nothing is more dangerous than a single idea when it's the only one we have, said Émile Auguste Chartier. Much better to practice silence, to continue to listen about what cannot be known with certainty, than to speak and declare an ignorance that can morph into conspiracy theories, untested dogmas, and other pseudo-certainties designed to separate and not to unite. So the principle here is this. When we give some name or voice to Tao, we're not practicing the holy discipline of listening. Do not seek God's name, for you will not find it. Everything with a name is named by someone stronger, so that one might call and the other obey. Who then has named God? God is not God's name, but an opinion about God. From the sentences of Sextus, a Christian. Elijah meets God at Horeb. He, God, said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 11 and 12. Listening to the sound of silence. How countercultural, maybe even revolutionary. Make no mistake, Tao's style is radically inscrutable, period. Words don't last. They can mislead. Their meanings change. So what to do? Practice silence, which carries its own delicate eloquence. Remain sensitive to Tao by bearing wordless witness to the ordinary course of things. In the book of Exodus, Moses confronted barefoot his God. He asked, "What is the divine name?" But all he got was an indefinite I am who I am. I will be what I will be. Or, as an Old Testament professor once said, I am the was is, the is, and the will be is. I am the ising one. My name is. However, even this creative language about God is suggestive in an anti-Tao way because it carries an inherent bias in favor of being. The is language. It assumes that God is being itself. And that's a nice start, but it's hardly a nice ending when considering God's vastness, power, and majesty. Footnote to Moses, though, he took this imprecise definition of God and created a liberation and religious movement. Those with ears would do well to listen. But back to Tao being without words. Tao Te Ching, verse 14, reminds us, one can look for the invisible but never discover it. One can listen out for the soundless but never hear it. One may try to grasp the immaterial but never touch it. We possess no inquiry into these three. Beloveds, remember this. Though we speak in modern language, these holy truths reach from generations past. The sacred stories we tell are made of the stuff that lasts when everything else fades away. They come from sources of wisdom tried and tested through struggle and silence. When the ones before us were pressed to their spiritual limits, bound by oppressive restraints, made weary by loss, these truths were a lifeline. It reaches to us still today. It is our medicine, our strength, our memory, our future. No matter the risks we face, we will not sever the threads of wisdom that weave our survival together. And that's from infleshed.com /liturgy/psalm-78-remix. Without words, Tao connects every single thing with the whole shebang. Tao eludes definition and control. It is as unpredictable as your next thought or tonight's dream. But, and this is important, without our usual habits of desire, it is there, ever present, and never twice the same. Verse 21 serves as commentary here. What is this Tao? It is entirely non-conceptual. Its essential nature is known only by its latent forms and elusive feel. How very hidden and obscure is its essence and core. Yet within this latency lies its core life force. Since ancient times until today, Tao's effects have never been absent. We bear witness to how it causes and charges all things. How do I know this? Intuition. Tao is always leaving a quiet tracing of its ways. So how do we discover Tao? When we confront mystery, we begin to wonder. For in mystery, we are struck dumb, wordless. Maybe wonder is the best way to see Tao. Tao's silent work in us is of wonder. Not of words or concepts that change with cultural whims. Silence, not sounds. A silence that bears witness. So clear out the noise and sound. Then one understands Tao, as this first verse says, understood through mystery. Through wonder, not words, is the royal road to the Taoist. Or anyone else who understand that they have a place in the interlocking, multicultural, intergalactic scheme of things, a scheme whose process is Tao. Therefore, wonder is a Tao discipline. Wonder is the way, or Tao, to a larger and ever larger we. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. Mary Oliver. Explanation separates us from astonishment, which is the only gateway to the incomprehensible. Eugene Ionesco. Our homework can go in one of three directions. 1. Who are you without words? What kind of life might emerge with a lessening in the sheer volume of words one uses? What happens to your life if you redirect your energies from chatty words to speechless wonder? 2nd, notice how words you hear or say can hide, mislead, obstruct, and even unintentionally. Paying attention to TV might be a good help for this one. 3, how do you tell your truths best with words or with actions. Pay attention to your habits here. They can be very revealing. This podcast is an original work designed, written, and produced by me, Marc Mullinax. Artwork by Aubrey Davis. Music is licensed through CyberDirector. The copyright for quotations is from Tao to Ching and held by Fortress Press. When this becomes a real podcast, I will ask you to support it by sharing it, by subscribing to its feed, by posting reviews on your podcast site so others can find it, and maybe through Patreon. Let me know if you might find Patreon a helpful way to support this podcast. May your days begin in peace and become laboratories for radical hope.